All right, hello everyone. We will be starting with this first lab here, which is just an introduction to anatomy and physiology. So talking about some anatomical terms, directional terms, and just the basic organs and organ systems. So this stuff is pretty basic, but it's really important because you're going to see all of this stuff throughout the semester. So when we get into different organ systems, start talking about muscles and bones, all of these directional terms, the anatomical position, all the stuff we're talking about in this first lab, you're going to see throughout the semester. So it's important that you really understand this, can take good notes and explain all these different concepts now so that later on the semester you know what all these words mean. Okay, so really important. Not very much information. This lecture is going to be really short, but important stuff. Okay, so to start, the anatomical position. So throughout the class, when we're talking about the body, we're talking about it as if it's in the anatomical position. So this guy here, standing, is in the anatomical position. So standing up, palms forward, right? So your thumbs are towards the outside of your body, and the toes facing forward as well. So this is important because it gives us a baseline when we're using different directional terminology. Um, when we talk about directional terms, it'll make sense in a second, but it's important that we're always referencing the body in the anatomical position. All right, so the front of the body is this, the back of the body is this, toes are forward, etc. And then another thing, anatomical landmarks. So all of these names here are just fancy names for things we already have names for, but they're anatomical names. So if we go to the doctor or physician and we have, a cut or a hurting in some certain area of our body, instead of saying the patient hurts in their upper arm, which is what a general person might say, the doctor would say they're hurting in their brachial region, right? So then all the doctors have the same sort of terminology that they're using when referencing the body. So what someone considers an upper arm, might be different person to person, but brachial is always going to be this region. Antecubital is always the inside of the elbow. Antebrachial would be the forearm region, right? So things that we already have general names for just have fancy anatomical names. Typically, this is kind of the most annoying part of the whole class because just so many of them. Lucky for you guys, you can use notes. So as long as you can reference this and figure out where all these lines are pointing to, it should be pretty straightforward. But these anatomical landmarks are really important. All right. When we're talking about the body, we can describe the relationship of different parts based on these directional terms. And this is the stuff that you're definitely going to see throughout the semester, especially when we start talking about the bones, we're going to talk about different membranes. We're going to use directional terms to describe their relationships to each other. So there's pairs of directional terms that you're going to see. I'm going to go through them all real quickly, but the first is superior and inferior. So superior is towards the top, inferior is towards the bottom. So in the anatomical position, superior is anything that's up towards the head, right? And inferior would be towards the feet. Again, this is why the anatomical position is so important, because if we're talking about the body when they're laying down, superior would be like the dog, right? Superior would be its back, inferior would be its belly side, right? So it's important when we're in anatomical position so that these directional terms mean what we want them to mean. Okay, so for example, you could use in a sentence, the eyes are superior to the mouth, right? Because our eyes are above where our mouth is. You could also say our hips are inferior to our shoulders, right? Or the antebrachial region is inferior to the brachial region. Okay, so superior and inferior, pretty straightforward. Anterior and posterior. Anterior is towards the front, posterior is towards the back. Okay, so anything on the front of the body compared to the back of the body. Again, an anatomical position is important because the anterior on a dog would be like its head, posterior would be its butt, not necessarily belly and back. Okay, I keep referencing the dog. Don't worry about the dog, worry about the human. But anterior is the front side, posterior is the back side. So you could say the nose is anterior to the ears, right? Or you could say the heel is posterior to the toe, okay? Next, we have ventral and dorsal. And this can get a little bit confusing, but in humans, ventral and dorsal is the same as anterior and posterior. So ventral is actually the belly side, dorsal is actually the back side. So anterior is front and back, ventral and dorsal is belly and back side, right? So in a dog, the belly side, the ventral side down here, which would be inferior in a dog, dorsal side, the back side would be superior in a dog. Okay, but in humans, anterior and ventral are kind of interchangeable. Posterior and dorsal are also interchangeable. I remember these terms. If you think dorsal, think of the dorsal fin on a shark. It's on its back, right? So on the dorsal side is the back side of the body. And then ventral side is the belly side. For this, I think of a dog, the ventral side, the belly side. I think of the dog standing over a vent, right, in the ground to like warm his little belly up. So I remember ventral side is the belly side that way. So same, you could say the nose is ventral to the ears. We have the spinal cord is dorsal to the, I don't know, gallbladder, whatever you want to say. Okay. Next, we have medial and lateral. So this picture doesn't actually show it very well. Medial is towards the midline of the body. So your nose through your belly button, right? If you're looking at the person from the front, this is different, but it kind of shows. So the medial would be towards the midline. Lateral is out towards the edges, right? So your nose would be medial to your ears. Your thumb would be lateral to your pinky, right? Lateral is towards the edge, medial is towards the middle, okay? It's pretty straightforward. Proximal and distal. This is talking about relationship compared to the point of origin. So normally we're going to talk about the appendages. So I'm going to go back to this picture again, proximal and distal. So the point of origin is where something attaches, right? So your arms attach here, your legs attach here at the hips. So something closer to that point of origin would be considered proximal. Further away would be distal. Okay, so proximal, close to the point of origin, distal, further away. So your elbow would be proximal to your wrist. Your ankle would be distal to your knee, right? Ankle's further away than your knee, so it's distal. So a lot of times when we're describing the relationship of two different places, like if I said the ankle is distal to the knee, that would be correct. But I could also say the ankle is inferior to the knee, right? Because it is below the knee. So there's sometimes some cases that we can use multiple directional terms to describe relationships. And on the quiz, if you're answering a question, as long as whatever you say is correct, you'll get the points for it. It doesn't have to be necessarily, there's not necessarily one correct answer. Okay, and then the last term here is superficial and deep. Superficial is towards the surface, and deep is like deep towards like the core of the body, if you want to call it. So I like to think of like the earth. The grass and the dirt is more superficial. As you get deeper into the earth towards like the lava or whatever, I don't know what's in the middle of the earth. Isn't it lava? I'm obviously not a geographist. What's that word? Okay, I sound dumb, but towards the center of the earth is whatever, that's deeper, right? So think of that as a human body. Obviously, we're not a perfect round earth, but in our head, our skin would be more superficial, the bone would be deep. And deeper to the bone, even yet, would be our brain, right? So you can think superficial and deep coming from like inside to outside. Okay, so these directional terms you're going to see throughout the semester. We talk about bones. You need to know which bone is proximal, which bone's distal, which bone's medial and lateral. And always, when we're talking about these directional terms, we're talking about the body in the anatomical position. It's really important that you remember that so that you can use these terms correctly. Okay. Next, we have body planes and body sections. So if we take the body in the anatomical position, like this girl is standing here, we can cut it in these different planes, right? So think if you're a doctor or a radiographer, is that what they're called? Radiologists, whatever they're called, people who take like MRIs or CAT scans. When you're doing a scan of the body, you can cut it in different planes, right? So you can either look at the body if we're cutting it through, the x-axis, y-axis, or z-axis, right? So these planes have different names. There's 3 of them. So first I'm going to start with a frontal plane. So the frontal plane is if you're cutting your body like ear to ear, right? Another name for this is coronal. Normally I will say coronal because I think of the head like a loaf of bread. And if you cut it like you're cutting a loaf of bread, it's a coronal section, and bread I think of beer, and beer I think of coronal. I don't know. I've always thought that for some odd reason. But if you're cutting ear to ear, so you're cutting the front part of the body off of the back part of the body, so separating the anterior and posterior sides, that's a frontal or coronal plane. This is really hard to do on a computer, but hopefully this makes sense. Okay, our second plane is a sagittal or median plane. So sagittal is cutting the right from the left, right? So you can move this around wherever you want in the body. You could do a sagittal plane over here, but you're separating a right side and a left side. When it's down directly, that middle line, so your nose and your belly button, that's called mid-sagittal. So it's right in the middle in a sagittal plane, okay? So sagittal, separating right and left. And then the last plane you can cut is a transverse plane, which would be parallel with the ground, right? The transverse plane is cutting the body into a superior and inferior part, right? Separating the top and the bottom of the body. Again, you can move this transverse plane up. You could cut like through the neck, cut the head off. So that would be cutting it in the transverse plane still. Okay, so all these planes you can move. And you think of like an MRI imaging, where you can kind of like scroll through, especially like fMRIs, where you can scroll through the different levels of the cuts. That's just moving these planes ever so slightly so you can see different parts of the body. Okay. Typically what we are going to ask questions is on like a brain slice. So we have models of the brain slices that typically right now I would show you. But the brain slice can be easily cut in these different planes. So coronal, like a loaf, think of it like a loaf of bread, right? Cutting the front from the back. Sagittal, cutting the right and the left. And transverse, cutting the top and the bottom. Okay. So this is just examples of what the brain looks like cut in those different sections. So a coronal or frontal section, you can see the 2 brain hemispheres like this. If you cut it in a sagittal section, cutting the right and the left, you can see kind of the inside view of the brain. And then if you do a transverse or horizontal section, you're like looking down at the brain from the top. Okay, so you can still see the 2 hemispheres there. So on the quiz, expect to see brain slices cut in these different sections, so make sure you can identify what section each brain slice is cut through. Next, we have to talk about some body cavities. So there's 2 main divisions in our body. We have 2 main cavities, which can be further divided. But the main cavities are the dorsal body cavity, which is this yellow section, on the dorsal side of the body, right, the back, think a dorsal fin, and the ventral cavity, which is the belly side. Okay, so the ventral cavity here is red, dorsal body cavity is yellow. Okay, so this can be further divided. Dorsal we can divide into the cranial, which contains the brain, and the vertebral, which contains the spinal cord, which is pretty straightforward. The ventral body cavity can be divided into a whole bunch of different ones. We have this top part, the thoracic body cavity, which is near your thoracic vertebrae. Okay, thoracic body cavity, we have the two pleural cavities that hold the lungs, the mediastinum, and the pericardial cavity that holds the heart. Okay, so all of this collectively is the thoracic. We have the pleural. Think there's two lungs, plural, multiple, right? Two cavities, mediastinum and pericardial. And then we also have the division, the abdominal pelvic cavity, which can be divided into just the abdominal cavity and just the pelvic cavity. So just a whole bunch of divisions, basically, named based on what they hold. Abdominal cavity contains digestive organs. Pelvic cavity contains your bladder, some reproductive organs, and your rectum. Okay. So all of these cavities have membranes that encase our organs. So all of our organs have some sort of membrane covering on them to help protect them, make sure like our organs aren't sticking together, aren't moving around too much. So in our dorsal body cavity, we have one type of membrane. In our ventral body cavity, we have a different type of membrane. Okay, so dorsal, yellow here, and ventral, red, have two different types of membranes. So let's start with the dorsal body cavity. In that dorsal body cavity is where our cranial and vertebral, where our brain and spinal cord are held. We have what's called the meninges. So our meninges are the membranes that cover our brain and our spinal cord. And there's three layers, okay? So from superficial towards the surface to deep towards the interior by the brain, we have our dura mater, arachnoid mater, and pia mater. Okay, so if we look at this, there's a lot of words we don't need to know. But here we have our brain down here, okay? This spongy part, that's showing our bone, okay? So skin on top with our hair. We have our bone here. So deep to the bone, we have our dura mater, which is the most superficial meninge, technically separated, but we're just going to call it one thing, dura mater. Deep to that, you have this purple part here. That's the arachnoid mater. In the arachnoid mater, you will always see these little kind of spider web looking structures. And I think arachnoid, spider, looks kind of spider webby. Okay. And then the deepest membrane, which is covering the surface of the brain and the surface of the spinal cord, is the pia mater. So this light blue that's going over every groove of the surface of the brain is the pia mater. Okay, so dura, arachnoid is in the middle, pia is the deepest, right? And this is in the dorsal body cavity, which is the brain and spinal cord. Okay, the rest of the membranes in our ventral body cavity are very different. So instead of just being a single layer, well, there's three layers, but they're all just one like sheet, if you'll say. The membranes in our ventral body cavity are made of serosa. So it's a fluid-filled sac. So if you think your book gives the example, if you take like a balloon filled with air and you shove your hand into the balloon, think of that how you would think of this membrane. So pretend the heart for a second is your hand and this blue on the outside is the balloon. When you put your hand into the balloon, there's a piece of balloon that's physically touching your hand, right? So that's this first layer of the membrane. Then you have the air in the balloon, right? Because there's still air in there. So there's a small gap filled with air. And then you have the outer layer of the balloon. So this outer layer of the membrane can be thought of as the outer layer of that balloon. So all the membranes in our ventral body cavity have the same makeup, okay? There's two layers filled, separated by serosa, which is just the fluid that helps lubricate the membranes and make sure they don't like stick together. Okay, so the membranes in a pericardial cavity are called the pericardium. Membranes in the pleural cavity are called the pleura. And abdominal pelvic cavity, we have our peritoneum. So the ventral body cavity membranes, they have three different names just based on where they're at. If they're around the heart, lungs, or around our digestive system organs. They also have a second part to their name, which is just saying which layer of the membrane it is. So if it's this layer directly touching the organs, the one that would be touching your hand in the balloon example, it's called your visceral. Okay, I think visceral for very close, right? That's very close to the organs. The other layer is called the parietal. So that's the outside layer that is lining the walls of the cavity. So for example, this is our heart. So this would be in our pericardial cavity. We have this membrane. So you have our visceral, very close, our visceral pericardium, which is this layer touching the heart. And then we have a parietal pericardium, which is this layer on the outside, right? So they're both considered pericardium because they're in our pericardial cavity, and we have visceral and parietal. Okay, same thing with our lungs. Again, then in the pleural cavity, so these are our pleura. This image is not quite as good, but touching our lungs would be our visceral, very close, visceral pleura. And then along the outside, lining the cavity, would be our parietal pleura. Okay, and then in our abdominal pelvic quadrant, again, these are all our digestive organs. This is the sagittal plane, so separating the right and the left. But again, digestive organs. So you can see there's membrane lining directly the organs. See, around every organ, there's this little membrane. So that would be our visceral, oh my gosh, parietal pleura, pericardium, peritoneum. There we go. Would be our visceral peritoneum, very close touching the organs. Oh, it says it right there. And then our parietal peritoneum is lining the cavity, right? So all along the outside, we have our parietal peritoneum. Okay? So pericardium in the heart, pleura in the lungs, and peritoneum in the rest of the organs. And all of these, in these gaps, we have that fluid, the serous fluid. So all in this space would be fluid filled to help lubricate and keep the organs kind of sliding. All right, coming up on the last few slides here, but body quadrants and body regions, again, just another way to divide our body. So when we're talking about different areas, we're all talking about the same thing. So we have quadrants, there's 4 of them, upper right, upper left, lower right, lower left. And it's always the patient's right or left. Okay, so we're talking about the right side of the body, the right hand, the right humerus, right femur, whatever we're talking about. The right side is your patient's right, and the left side is the patient's left. All right, and these, way to break up the body is important because if a patient again has like a pain somewhere, writing on, the sheet or whatever you want to call it, the doctor's notes. It's important that when the doctor is writing something, the patient has pain in the upper right quadrant. It's important that we use these types of terms so that it's consistent between people who might be reading those notes later on. It also kind of helps us determine where there might be some issues. So it's important to know not only the names of the quadrants, but what can be found in them. The upper right quadrant is mostly the liver, the gallbladder. Upper left, we have the majority of the stomach, right? The lower quadrants are kind of a mismatch of everything. You have small intestine, large intestine, bladder down here. Spleen would be over here, right? So it's important to know what organs are in each quadrant. I'm not going to go through all the organs with you. It's in your book. It might be review for a lot of you. If it's not review for you, take some time and learn the names of all the organs. We also have body regions, which is doing essentially the same thing, but dividing it a bit further, just a little bit more specific. So the regions is like a tic-tac-toe board. There's 9 regions total. Epigastric, left hypochondriac, right hypochondriac. Umbilical by your belly button. Left lumbar, right lumbar. You can think lumbar is by like the lumbar vertebrae. Hypogastric or pubic region. And then left iliac and right iliac. I think the top of your hips is called the iliac crest, which is where that gets its name. So same thing, you should know which organs are in which quadrant, and your lab manual goes through that. So just go through and take some notes, read through that, make sure you understand that. And then the very last thing, again, just organs and organ systems. So it's important that you can be able to identify the organs, know their names, where they're located in the body. So if I were to show you a picture and label an organ, you need to be able to tell me what that organ is. But you should also know the breakdown of the organ systems. So these are all of the organ systems: tegumentary system, skeletal, muscular, nervous, endocrine, cardiovascular, lymphatic, respiratory, digestive, urinary, and reproductive. So you should know what organs are involved in each of these systems. So for example, if I tell you the bladder, you should know that's urinary. If I ask you about the brain, that'd be nervous, right? If I say ovaries, reproductive, and also endocrine, right? So some of the organs have multiple functions, but it's important that you know at least one, what organ system each organ's a part of. Digestive, you could have your intestines, pancreas, all that good stuff. Okay, so again, read through this in your book. It might be a review for a lot of you, but just catch up on that, take some notes. I'd recommend writing out the organ systems, their general function, and then what organs are involved in all of them. So for example, on the quiz, I might say, name this labeled organ. So you should be able to tell me that that's the heart. What organ system is this a part of? You should know that that's cardiovascular. Okay. Another example, name this labeled organ. You should be able to tell me that that's the stomach. Which abdominal pelvic quadrant? So remember quadrants 4. So it'd be the upper quadrant, and it would be the left side. So upper left quadrant. Okay, so that's just some examples of things that you might be able to see on the quiz, kind of some question format. Again, since we don't have actual lab time to go through, look at the models, do all that, it's really important that you're going through your book, taking notes, and making sure that you're actually learning this stuff, okay? So there's some really good apps that you can look at the human body. Anatomy TV is linked on my EduCat. There's some apps for your iPhone too. I have some on mine that are really cool. You can kind of scroll through, look at all these different organs. But just, you know, listening to my lecture, doing the homework, and taking the quiz isn't really enough for you guys to actually learn this. It's going to take some time to work through to actually know the material. Okay, the lab is normally 2 hours long. Summer lab is even longer than that. I don't even know how long it's supposed to be. But you should be spending a significant amount of time with this material and actually really trying to get to know it. Especially if you plan on taking BI 208, which probably a lot of you are. The information kind of builds on itself. So if you don't actually learn the shit now, trust me that later on you're going to struggle. Okay? With this class being online, it's all kind of self-motivated. You get out of it what you want to put into it. And I know everyone has a lot going on. It's easy to kind of just take the easy road, just skim on by, but I really recommend that you take the time to learn the stuff, take really good notes, practice labeling stuff, make sure you can spell things, right? The quiz spelling is going to count. So, yeah, if you have any questions, let me know. You can post in the question forum or send me an email. If there's something that doesn't make sense or you want me to try to clarify further, I'd be happy to even record another video trying to explain it a little bit better. If you want me to actually go in and look at the models, I can take some videos of the models in lab and post those with me going through everything. So really whatever you guys need, let me know and I'd be happy to try to help. Okay, so that concludes the first lab, not too bad. This week you also have lab 2, which is diffusion and osmosis. So once you're finished with the homework and stuff from this lab, make sure you also are doing lab 2 this week. All right.